Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Caesar's Palace for 12 rounds of boxing. In the red corner, from Los Angeles, California, wearing the red trunks with the gold trim, weighing in at 125 pounds, the lightweight champion of the world, Danny Little Red Lopez. Well, Bill, our winners get a home theater receiver. That's right. Experience the full potential of high-definition video with this 72-channel digital home theater receiver from Yamaha. But wait, that's not all. They also get a 5.1-channel surround sound system from Mirage. With 5 palm-sized speakers and a compact subwoofer cube, the MX 5.1 brings you huge immersive sound with Mirage's omnipolar technology. All from the Spiegel catalog, Chicago, Illinois, 60609. And they're taking closer order as down the stretch they come. Mr. Hot Stuff has 3 lengths to make up with chocolate candy last. On the rail, take the points behind that gallant son with chocolate candy gaining on the outside. In the lead is Pioneer of the Nile being tackled by chocolate candy. They're neck and neck as they come to the wire. And Pioneer of the Nile holds off chocolate candy and wins the Santa Anita Derby. And now, on your feet, time to greet holder of 14 NBA titles, your home team, your Los Angeles Lakers. Number 3 at 6'8", 5th year out of UCLA, playing forward, Trevor Ariza. Starting at center, number 17 at 7 feet, 4th year out of St. Andrews High School, Andrew Bynum. And at guard, number 24, 6'6", 13th season out of Loyal Marion High School, Kobe Bryant.
Men aren't allowed to be sad. We're allowed to be one of 2 things. We're allowed to be mad or fine. That's it, right? Those are normal behaviors of a man. You can be mad like, Jesus Christ, who put this here? How many times do I gotta say, keep this goddamn area clean? Jesus Christ, somebody's gonna fall, break their neck. I'm so tired of it. Said it once, I said it 100 times, right? And then what does your wife just rolls her eyes? Just send him out in the yard, let him walk it off. Throw him a beer out there, he'll be fine, right? Yeah, he'll be good, right? You're allowed to be that or fine. How you doing, Bill? I'm fine. You sure? Yeah, I'm sure. I said it was fine. Why the would I say it's fine? Then you're just right back over there. And your whole life is that. And what's weird about a guy is we feel all the other emotions, right? Melancholy, being sentimental, enjoying a sunset, all of that type of But all this in here is just called gay, right?
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, March the 15th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for anti-radicals, rules for retrogrades, motivation, meditation, and rules for patriots. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
indigo, that feeling goes stealing down to my shoes while I sit and sigh. Go long blue, awake at the moon indigo, sees my baby say goodbye. In the evening when lies are low, I'm so lonesome I could cry. 'Cause there's nobody who care about me. I'm just a soul of blue where the blue can be. When I get the moon indigo, I could lay me down and die.
Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
As government regulates business more, That favors corporations large enough to have substantial legal and compliance departments. Regulation serves as a kind of fixed cost to doing business, discouraging market entry. Not only do higher rates of regulatory growth correlate with increases in market concentration ratios, but the period during which regulation increased significantly, 1990 to 2000, was followed by increases in market concentration. None of those correlations prove causality, but at the very least it is possible that government regulation is a major force behind the rise of market power. Tyler Cowen. Regulation is a subsidy. There is no more cronyist tool in human history than that of regulation. It favors the already big and discourages, if not pulverizes, the aspirational.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the second half of Chapter 7 of Rules for Anti-Radicals. Education versus Grassroots Mobilization. In exercising indirect power, you can rely on either education of politicians or the public or grassroots mobilization. The Foundation for Applied Conservative Leadership preaches that education is ineffective, particularly when directed at the public, since vast amounts of money can be spent to change very little. Members of the public, after all, aren't the ones formulating public policy. Grassroots mobilization, by contrast, is more efficient. You can use it to immediately change the environment of the decision makers by applying or withholding what they want most: votes, money, power, and public accolades. I would add only that you don't do some of the level of education, you will eventually find yourself unable to swing the 3% plus one of voters required to win elections, and you will ultimately lose. That is why I advise using op-eds, letters to the editor, social media, and comments to online articles wherever possible as cheap ways to augment grassroots mobilization. Objectives of political action. In college, I earned spending money by gambling at backgammon, which I regard as a better metaphor for battle than chess, because its outcomes depend in part on chance, in this case, the roll of the dice. Those who lost to me in backgammon often whined that I was lucky. What they failed to realize is that I courted Lady Luck by preparing the battlefield. Setting up the board so the maximum number of rolls of the dice would benefit me. That is precisely what you will do with political action. Legislative versus election objectives. Objectives of legislative operations. To manipulate the political process, whether in a city council, state assembly, Congress, or other body, you achieve your desired outcome by influencing the target, either to change laws or regulations, or the interpretation or enforcement thereof, or to prevent change. Objectives of election operations. First, to prepare the legislative battlefield by manipulating elections to elect favorable representatives and thereby maximize your chances of legislative success. Second, to demonstrate to politicians your ability to impact elections, thereby motivating susceptible players through either fear or greed to support you. Politics as the adjudication of power. It's nice to be nice, and it's good to be right, but alas, political effectiveness depends on neither. Politics is the adjudication of power. Who wields it, how, and at whom. By adjudication, I mean the formalization of how power is applied, be it by legislative body, court, or commission. However politely it is wielded, what you are witnessing is the raw application of power by one human being or group over another. But, you insist, this is a democracy. Actually, ours is a constitutional republic, not a democracy, but we'll save that discussion for another time. What you need to understand is that even our republic, as intended by the framers, does not eschew the application of power. Rather, it creates a relatively just and usually nonviolent means for applying power. Machiavellian power politics is alive and well. Niccolo de Bernardo de Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527, Florentine diplomat, political philosopher, and author of The Prince, is often considered the father of modern political science. Although sometimes denounced for advocating deception and treachery, he recognized that man's basest instincts generally drive his quest to control others. In a Machiavellian world, altruism, if it exists at all, is rare indeed. Machiavellian power politics dominate all political systems, however democratic or autocratic such systems may be. What differentiates ours is that, at least in theory, we settle power struggles with elections and courts rather than bullet-riddled automobiles. For that, you can thank the framers who designed a republican system of government which, like Machiavelli, acknowledges man's innate quest for power. Accordingly, they create an intricate set of checks and balances between competing branches of government in order to prevent any single entity from gaining complete control. It is precisely that system of checks and balances which leftists seek to undermine in order to consolidate power. While Saul Alinsky earns justifiable condemnation for arguing that his ends justify almost any means, he correctly treats means and ends as different, entirely independent factors. As an activist, you must learn to separate the application of power from the, hopefully, high-minded goals for which you intend to apply it. What politics is not. Politics is not the art of compromise. In fact, compromise, as your opposition defines it, is a process in which you might lose less than under their original proposal, but you still lose. Saul Alinsky made clear the left's use of compromise when he said, "To the organizer, compromise is a key and beautiful word. It is always present in the pragmatics of operation. If you start with nothing, demand 100%, then compromise for 30%. You're 30% ahead." What Alinsky neglects mentioning is that, having settled for 30%, his minions will soon be back for the rest, typically under the guise of closing loopholes in what they didn't get the first time. They will repeat this until you are left with nothing. That is why preemptive compromise, aka preemptive concession, as a political tactic invariably fails. In 2013, for example, Obama et al. Wanted Senate Bill 649 for universal background checks on gun purchases, a bill actually intended to turn the computerized National Instant Background Check System, NICS, into a de facto gun registry. While some admittedly well-meaning gun rights leaders pushed the so-called Toomey Manchin Compromise, we put together a 39-member Stop the Ban coalition, which refused to compromise, accepting nothing less than death of the bill. We won, and Senate Bill 649 died. 9 years later, the left has still made no significant inroads on expanding NICS. Had the Toomey Manchin Compromise prevailed, however, we would still be fighting for increasingly smaller exemptions from universal gun registration. What advocates of preemptive compromise seemingly fail to understand is that once they concede to part of the opposition agenda, they concede the need for all of it. What politics is. In truth, politics is the art of conflict, vectors of political force applied by a small minority. Unfortunately for conservatives, the left has long understood this and applied it to your disadvantage. It is why 80% of Americans support voter ID laws, but only 36 states have them. Morton Blackwell, founder of the Leadership Institute, has been quoted as saying, "Political success is determined by the number and effectiveness of the political activists on either side." Your goal should be to use activists to create conflict, forcing the center of debate toward the right and toward what has always been the mainstream of American political opinion. And you will do so not through compromise or education, but via the application of political force. Your goal, quite frankly, is to impose your will on the opposition. And let's see what's next. The 2 seasons of political action. Just as political action divides into arenas of legislative operations and election operations, so too each arena has its own season. In the former, the chamber is in session and actively legislating. In the latter, it generally adjourns to give politicians time to campaign. Although time frames for the two may occasionally overlap, treat them as distinct but closely related theaters of operation. Objectives of the two seasons. Objectives of legislative season. To impact lawmaking by twisting the arms of politicians, particularly by deluging them in channeled input. Most grassroots organizations stop here, usually to their own detriment. Objectives of election season. To leverage your input during the legislative season by systematically awarding or withholding the votes, money, power, and public accolades politicians so love. You reward desirable and punish undesirable behavior. Without the threat of political action, polls will pay far less attention to your legislative action. The value of payback. Says Mike Rothfield, unless you are politically feared, you will not be politically respected. Make that your mantra and do not deviate from it. And that was the second half of Chapter 7 of Rules for Anti-Radicals. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 24. When a rival or overlord like Alexander the Great comes to visit you, offering gifts, be the philosopher Diogenes the Cynic. Tell the radical mob or despot that you want nothing from them except that they stand out of your light. In a rule above, the retrograde exemplar was Alexander. In this case, the exemplar is his adversary, Diogenes, who scornfully rebuffed the great ruler. Consider Plutarch's account of the strange encounter between two of the most dissimilar great men in history. Thereupon, many statesmen and philosophers came to Alexander with their congratulations, and he expected that Diogenes of Sinope also, who was tarrying in Corinth, would do likewise. But since that philosopher took not the slightest notice of Alexander, and continued to enjoy his leisure in the suburb Cranion, Alexander went in person to see him, and he found him lying in the sun. Diogenes raised himself up a little when he saw so many people coming towards him, and fixed his eyes upon Alexander. And when that monarch addressed him with greetings, and asked if he wanted anything, "Yes," said Diogenes, "stand a little out of my sun." It is said that Alexander was so struck by this, and admired so much the haughtiness and grandeur of the man, who had nothing but scorn for him, that he said to his followers, who were laughing and jesting about the philosopher as they went away, "But truly, if I were not Alexander, I wish I were Diogenes." And Diogenes replied, "If I wasn't Diogenes, I would be wishing to be Diogenes too." Here's the moral of the story. Never accept a gift or a nicety from an opponent, much less from the social justice mob. Never embrace an entitlement, bread or circuses, offered by Machiavellian politicians. Bread and circuses prove to be the wage by which radicals purchase their ill-gotten office and by which the individual is parted from his liberty. Acceptance of economic favors from radicals puts one into their debt and robs the goodly man of his honor and self-possession. In other words, be magnanimous, offering aid to all in your path, but accepting it only from the most trusted friends, even then, only with great hesitation. Once in a great while, one meets a radical not completely inoculated against the winsome allure of extemporaneous Christian virtue. Do not hold your breath, but you may just convert a radical through your example of magnanimity. Aristotle defines the virtue of magnanimity in the following terms. The great-souled, magnanimous man is fond of conferring benefits, but ashamed to receive them, because the former is a mark of superiority and the latter of inferiority. He continues down the page. It is also characteristic of the great-souled man never to ask help from others, or only with reluctance, but to render aid willingly, and to be haughty towards men of position and fortune, but courteous towards those of moderate station, because it is difficult and distinguished to be superior to the great, but easy to outdo the lowly. It is like putting forth one's strength against the weak. In these short lines, Aristotle explains why the magnanimous Diogenes would rebuff a man so admirable as Alexander, because he alone was worthy of a challenge. He alone was worthy of Diogenes's haughtiness. The retrograde must reclaim classical magnanimity for himself and for his people. He must learn to emulate both the great-souled man's virtue and his contempt for the mob. Aristotle closes by mocking pretenders to magnanimity who merely imitate the great-souled man without being really like him, only copying him in what they can, reproducing his contempt for others, but not his virtuous conduct. For the great-souled man is justified in despising vicious people. His estimates are correct, but most proud men have no good ground for their pride. Retrogrades, be restored to magnanimity, reclaiming righteous contempt for vicious men, but first reclaim virtue. Remain unattached and unindebted to the mob.
And that was Rule 24 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy J. and David R. Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of motivation.
Everyone says, well, you should be harmless, virtuous. You shouldn't do anyone any harm. You should sheath your competitive instinct. You shouldn't try to win. You know, you don't want to be too aggressive. You don't want to be too assertive. You want to take a back seat and all of that. It's like, no, wrong. You should be a monster, an absolute monster. And then you should learn how to control it.
It's impossible to respect yourself until you grow those mental teeth. And when you grow those teeth, you realize that you're dangerous.
You begin to demand success for yourself. You're no longer wishing or hoping things work out. You're going to make it happen no matter what. So you start carrying yourself with a different level of confidence and conviction that says to the world, I will not stop.
I am going to assess the situation. I am going to come up with a plan, and I am going to execute.
I'm going to go get it because I'm built for it. If you set out and you say you're going to do something, do yourself a favor and don't lie to yourself. That is the worst thing that an individual can ever do.
The people in life that win play offense, not defense. Stop backing into everything. Stand up. Bow your back a little bit. Start to walk a little different. Start to be that best version of you. You can do it in your quiet way. You can do it the way you do it. But somehow they got to look at you and go, okay, I won't monkey with that one.
I need you to put the type of effort forward that the world knows don't come from you.
You have to develop a doggedness. You got to have some toughness in you. And the only way to develop toughness is you got to practice being tough. And you cannot practice being tough by quitting every time you get tired, by stopping every time you don't feel like it, by giving up every time it gets challenged. That's what's wrong with people now. People don't make it because they always give up when it get hard. You know, it's so challenging now. You know, they was talking about me. I feel weak. I'm tired. Life don't give a damn about you being tired. You got to get about the business now. You want to be successful, you got to get at it. You got to stop all this soft shit and all that mess, man. You got to get at it. You got to tear their mouth out.
When you go out there, I need you to have that dog. When you get out there, I need you kill or be killed when you get out there. When you get out there, whatever you can get, go get it. Because they gonna get it before you get it. And they ain't gonna give it to you. So you go out there and get what's yours.
A true monster's mentality is when you're willing to forgo rest, forgo comfort, forgo personal desires, forgo whatever it takes to be better than you were yesterday. And every single time you feel like quitting, remember all those hours and days you sacrificed to get to where you are.
It's going to take you getting a hold of this thing and not letting go. You're going to have to fight and fight and fight till you can't fight anymore. Whatever it takes, I will do whatever I have to do
do to get to the other side, to make it over, to press through this. Nothing will hold me back. Nothing will stop me.
If there's something that you want and you're hungry for it, you got to do whatever is necessary until. And when you give the best you can and that's not enough, you must do what is required. And don't give up on yourself. Don't throw the towel in so quickly. Many people give up on the 1-yard line. There will be things that will happen to you in life that will get you down. But you must always stand up inside yourself and know that you can handle this. You've got to stand up to it and say, I'm going to do this anyhow, and I'm not going to let you stop. And you've got to be so relentless that you're always looking for a way to get over, always looking for a way that you can break through, always looking for a way that you can win, always looking for a way that you can strike a telling blow.
If you tell that thing, I'm here just like you here, and I promise you, I ain't leaving without the degree. I will not leave without that goal. I will not leave without that dream. I will not leave this university. I will not leave this job. I will not leave this client. I will not leave this opportunity until I'm successful. And you can't go back to that same old mindset. You gotta focus on this new day, this new mindset, these new goals. You can do it because that monster inside of you won't give up. That monster inside of you won't give in. That monster inside of you won't throw in the towel.
Failing doesn't mean you quit. It means you failed, but get back up and continue to push that bar higher and higher and higher. When you're constantly pushing and getting up earlier and getting up earlier and getting up earlier and fighting through pains and discomforts, you don't care about failure. You actually welcome it. That means you set the bar so high that it's like, oh, I failed. That's where I need to be. Now I got to figure it out. You have to be uncommon amongst uncommon in your world. It takes everything. And then when you think you've given everything, you've just begun.
And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we're in meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for patriots.
Chapter 4, Commandment 3, never accept the premise of your opponent's argument. Premise is a word many Americans are not familiar with, and neither do they use it in their everyday speech. However, the premise is one of the most powerful weapons in political warfare. Master the art of the premise, and you will master your opponent. A premise is the assumption of an argument that is meant to justify the conclusion the one making the argument is hoping you'll come to. If one fails to establish the premise of his argument, one almost always fails to convince others of his conclusion. On the other hand, if one establishes a premise, one will more than likely get others to agree with his conclusion. For example, if the premise of the argument is over reproductive choice and not the sanctity of human life, then the conclusion will come down on the side of the premise accepted. If there's one thing the Republicrats are good at, it's accepting the left's premise on virtually everything. As a result, for too long we have argued with the left over the conclusion, e.g., big government versus small government, when we should be arguing over the premise, e.g., what's legal for the government to do versus what's illegal for the government to do. Thankfully, there were plenty of grassroots conservatives who have read the Constitution that could invade many of the town halls held by the ruling class in the summer of 2009 and attack their flawed premise. These town halls became a treasure trove of sound bites for talk show hosts like me, with the ruling class caught on tape saying all kinds of stupid and anti-constitutional things. This set the stage for the midterm uprising of 2010, when several Republicrats were defeated in primaries, and more than 700 Democrats nationwide were fired by the American people at the polls. This was all done in spite of the leadership of the Republican Party, not because of it. We had to drag the GOP leadership kicking and screaming across the finish line. While we were basing our arguments against Obamacare on the law of the land, the Republican Party establishment was relying on shallow talking points like, we can't afford it. It's tough to argue we can't afford it when the other side is arguing on behalf of every contrived class of victims in the culture. If you were a politician, would you rather be identified with Robin Hood or Ebenezer Scrooge? On the other hand, if you argue the legality of legislation rather than its supposed good intentions, the entire argument is reframed in your favor. Because if the basis for government action in our system is simply good intentions, then what can't the government do? Moreover, what or who determines which and whose intentions are good? Every despot and dictator believes his intentions are good, and alternative definitions for good intentions have led to some of the wickedest government in history. Our founding fathers knew this, so they accomplished a first in the history of mankind, a constitution that binds the jurisdiction and conscience of the state rather than the individual. Prior to our Constitution, governments issued legal documents to clearly define the rights of citizens and operated under the premise that all rights and privileges came from government. Our Constitution begins with the premise that our rights come from God and that government's only role is to secure and protect those God-given rights. For example, since God grants all people the right to call on Him, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved, when their hearts are convicted to do so, our government has an obligation to protect your religious freedom. Another example might be, since God grants us the right to self-defense, our government has an obligation to protect and enforce the Second Amendment. The Constitution is a plainly worded, objective moral standard of self-governance. It is no more a living, breathing document than is the Bible, and it's no coincidence the same people who believe the Bible is open to their subjective whims believe the same of the Constitution. Once someone defies God's authority, defying man's authority becomes no big deal. We are not predicated on the rule of victims, but the rule of law.
Our founders loathed the term democracy for a reason, because it has a penchant to devolve into mob rule. This is why they established a republic, where our elected officials are not our rulers or leaders, but rather our representatives and employees. Since their opportunity to govern comes only from the consent of the governed, we are in essence utilizing them as our proxies. And the power we have afforded them, we can take back and give to someone else if they're not doing the job we want them to do. Our founders read in the Bible where it says, "Do not pervert justice, do not show partiality to the poor or favoritism to the great, but judge your neighbor fairly." We're not to be intimidated by someone of great wealth and influence, nor are we to be emotionally manipulated by the downtrodden. What we are to do is perpetuate a government where there is no caste system, but rather everyone is held accountable to the same standard no matter their station in life, and everyone has an equal opportunity to pursue happiness. Another group of people once rose to power, promising their own government-imposed definition of fairness. They were called Bolsheviks. In America, we promise the freedom to exploit your God-given talent to its fullest potential, and you face the consequences for failure or reap the rewards for success. Now, which system would you rather defend? Let's take a look at several key economic questions facing the country right now for examples of not accepting the left's premise. I was once asked by a website to join an esteemed list of contributors, most of whom are smarter and more well-known than me, in an ongoing conversation about some of the hot-button economic issues facing the country. With folks representing the Cato Institute, Club for Growth, Stanford University, as well as names like Dinesh D'Souza, Grover Norquist, Star Parker, and James Taranto, having already answered the site's questions, I was wondering what it is I could possibly contribute to the conversation that hadn't already been said. That's when it dawned on me that often debates about the future of the country immediately jump to the conclusion of our worldview when we should be arguing the premise. For example, we argue for limited government when the real argument is why someone is for small government or big government. Drawing this distinction is more important than ever before, because there is a debate within conservative circles about whether limited government and freedom can occur in a vacuum apart from addressing the moral issues or the condition of the culture. And the answer to that question is absolutely not. You cannot have limited/self-government without first having a moral people capable of governing themselves. And you cannot have a moral people without the sort of spiritual awakening in a culture that preceded this republic in the first place. It's no coincidence the more we collectively turn our backs on our spiritual heritage, the more immoral the culture becomes, and thus the bigger the government gets. For if men will not be ruled by God, they must be ruled by other men. Otherwise, there's no higher authority we can call upon to settle our disputes and disagreements with one another. The more we need the rule of man, the bigger the government gets. The more we submit to the rule of God, the smaller the government gets. With this in mind, I decided to answer their questions from a worldview standpoint rather than attempt to discuss tactical economics with those who know a lot more about it than I do. If we cannot challenge the premise of the left's belief system, we cannot deconstruct it. And if we can't deconstruct it, we certainly will not be able to defeat it. Currently, we are not challenging the left's premise. We are venting about the conclusion/application of their premise. Read the questions and then my answers to get an idea of what it means to never accept the premise of your opponent's argument. First question: what causes an economy to prosper? Answer: the most prosperous economies are those that truly understand the role of government. As it is stated in our founding document, the Declaration of Independence, there is a God. Our rights come from him, and the only purpose of government is to secure and defend those God-given rights. To put it another way, government is to encourage, not do good, and punish evil. Of course, government in and of itself is not a moral agent, and usually inflicts the most horrors on humanity when it attempts to be. So it needs another institution to define for it what is good and what is evil. That is the role of the church and the family. These clearly defined spheres of jurisdiction between cultural institutions are what produce the proper balance of liberty and morality, thus allowing for the most prosperity. Next question: What role should government play in an economy? Answer. The biggest misconception is that we're having a debate about the role of government in America today, when we're really having a debate about what authority or moral ethic are we going to govern ourselves by. The answer to that question then determines the role of government. For example, cultures that abandon the Judeo-Christian moral ethic as ours is currently doing end up growing government because something must fill the God-shaped void. Justice, law, education, validation, charity, etc. in the society. And that something usually ends up being the state. As G.K. Chesterton once observed, when government removes God, government then becomes the God. Next question. What kind of tax system is most effective? Answer. The tax and monetary system that was in place in this country prior to 1913, which was prior to the confiscatory federal income tax and the printing of a fiat currency, that helped encourage the greatest growth of human freedom and prosperity the world has ever known. Since abandoning that foundation, we have increasingly become a debtor nation/people. I may have gone to public school and not the Ludwig von Mises Institute for Advanced Austrian Libertarian Economics, but even I'm smart enough to know to go back to what worked before. Question. How do high taxes on the wealthy impact an economy? Answer. Every job I've ever had came from a rich person, so I'm not sure how punitively punishing the very people who provide jobs will create more of them. Question. What is the cause and solution to poverty? Answer. The greatest way to combat poverty is to first recognize what causes it in the first place. Sinful human nature. Sometimes that sinful human nature manifests itself as a robber baron who exploits the community's natural and human resources, thus making it harder, if not impossible, for his fellow man to maximize his God-given talent so he can provide for himself and his family. Sometimes that sinful human nature manifests itself in the wrongful choices individuals make that put their livelihood and prosperity at risk. Either way, this is the reason why God gave the church the primary role of distributing charity in human society, because ultimately the church has the moral message to confront the evils that cause poverty in the first place. When an amoral agent like the state intervenes instead, best it can do is apply a Band-Aid to a flesh wound. It can treat the symptom, but it lacks the prescription to become the cure. Then, after a while, it becomes an enabler of the very thing it's trying to fix, just like it is today. Question. What role do workers' unions play in an economy? Answer. Human history has shown that whenever power is concentrated in the hand of a few, or just one, corruption is bound to take place regardless of the belief system of those or the one in whose hands the power lies. That's why historically unions played a vital role as a check and balance on unfettered corporate power. Obviously, unions have also struggled with the same fallen nature manifested as corruption that corporatists have. Nowadays, unfortunately, unions, particularly government sector unions, do not primarily serve the needs of their workers, but are more or less a funding stream and campaign platform for the Democrat Party. So while the union bosses have a seat at the table, the workers are worse off. Question. How does a minimum wage requirement impact an economy? Answer. How can a government know what the minimum wage should be? Can anyone even support a family on the minimum wage? Here is the reality. Real wages in this country have declined in relation to the rate of inflation/debt since these sorts of government schemes to contrive equality began. Our wages nowadays do not have the buying power in a consumer-driven economy they once had, which is one of the reasons we carry so much debt. Just about every major purchase a family makes these days is made on credit. These schemes are actually harming the very people they purport to help because they're operating outside the natural laws of economics. Let me give an example. Suppose a movie theater owner has calculated the job of popcorn attendant is worth $5 an hour based on his business model and the current job market. In other words, based on finite objective standards. However, the government comes in and mandates he pay a minimum of $10 an hour for that job instead, under the subjective guise of fairness. The movie theater owner doesn't just cut into his own profit margin to cover the increased cost out of the kindness of his own heart, but rather jacks up the price of popcorn to pass along his cost to the consumer. Now the market, tethered by competition, is no longer setting the price, but government artificially is. That sounds well and good until you and I go buy a popcorn the next time we're at the theater, and we're still making the same amount of money we were making before the price got jacked up. Since we can't go back to our bosses and demand a raise to cover our popcorn habit, right away our buying power is diminished by this government intrusion into a consumer-driven economy. Not to mention, so is the popcorn attendance, because on his night off, when he takes his date to the movies, he'll notice he's making more money, but now this date is costing him more money too. He's essentially being given the bill for his own minimum wage increase. And he'll notice the same thing at the restaurant he takes her to, and everywhere else where entry-level workers were given a completely contrived minimum wage increase. In other words, his minimum wage increase is at best a revenue-neutral transaction once the arbitrary consumer price increase offsets the arbitrary minimum wage increase he got from Uncle Sam. Meaning, at best, he'll break even, and most of the time, it's a loss leader. This partially explains why the explosion in government since 2007 has led to a reduction in American wealth to 1992 levels. We're buying goods and services at 2012 prices with a standard of living that is 20 years old. We have a saying on our radio show, why be in a hurry to be wrong? I know our willingness to immediately comment on things we actually haven't researched and analyzed frustrates some in this instant gratification world, but it also helps us to sleep well at night and avoid looking foolish, as the Huffington Post recently did. Headline said fast food workers are demanding a living wage of $15 an hour. Of course, how do we know that's actually a living wage? Why not demand $20 an hour, or $50 an hour, or $100 an hour? A full-time job that pays $15 an hour comes out to $31,200 a year, not counting overtime. Can you really live the American dream, own a home, own a car, send your kids to good schools, and then eventually college, one family vacation per year on $31,200? After all, the federal poverty line for a family of four is currently $23,550 per year, but I digress. Of course, never wanting an opportunity to play class warfare, outlets like the Huffington Post, owned by Arianna Huffington, who's got a net worth of $35 million, so of course she identifies with the plight of the downtrodden, were overly eager to report as fact analysis of McDonald's financials from an alleged University of Kansas research assistant named Arnobio Moralex. Moralex reported that if McDonald's immediately doubled all the wages of its employees, including the $9 million CEO, it would only have to raise the cost of a Big Mac by 68 cents and its dollar menu to $1.17 per item. This comes out to a measly 17% price increase. It all sounds well and good, of course, in magical thinking land, but there's one small problem. Moralex is full of shinola. First of all, you can't on one hand simply imply McDonald's is a greedy corporation that refuses to pay its employees a living wage and then fail to recognize that if McDonald's could get away with just arbitrarily raising their prices by 17%, they already would have done it. Wouldn't the greedy corporation you're smearing actually be bilking employees and customers at the same time if they could? Of course they would. Especially since customers pay into the business model, while employees are overhead that subtract from it. Best it can do is apply a Band-Aid to a flesh wound. It can treat the symptom, but it lacks the prescription to become the cure. Then, after a while, it becomes an enabler of the very thing it's trying to fix, just like it is today. Question: what role do workers' unions play in an economy? Answer: human history has shown that whenever power is concentrated in the hand of a few, or just one, corruption is bound to take place regardless of the belief system of those or the one in whose hands the power lies. That's why historically unions played a vital role as a check and balance on unfettered corporate power. Obviously, unions have also struggled with the same fallen nature manifested as corruption that corporatists have. Nowadays, unfortunately, unions, particularly government sector unions, do not primarily serve the needs of their workers, but are more or less a funding stream and campaign platform for the Democrat Party. So while the union bosses have a seat at the table, the workers are worse off. Question: how does a minimum wage requirement impact an economy? Answer: how can a government know what the minimum wage should be? Can anyone even support a family on the minimum wage? Here is the reality. Real wages in this country have declined in relation to the rate of inflation/debt since these sorts of government schemes to contrive equality began. Our wages nowadays do not have the buying power in a consumer-driven economy they once had, which is one of the reasons we carry so much debt. Just about every major purchase a family makes these days is made on credit. These schemes are actually harming the very people they purport to help because they're operating outside the natural laws of economics. Let me give an example. Suppose a movie theater owner has calculated the job of popcorn attendant is worth $5 an hour based on his business model and the current job market. In other words, based on finite objective standards. However, the government comes in and mandates he pay a minimum of $10 an hour for that job instead, under the subjective guise of fairness. The movie theater owner doesn't just cut into his own profit margin to cover the increased cost out of the kindness of his own heart, but rather jacks up the price of popcorn to pass along his cost to the consumer. Now the market, tethered by competition, is no longer setting the price, but government artificially is. That sounds well and good until you and I go buy a popcorn the next time we're at the theater, and we're still making the same amount of money we were making before the price got jacked up. Since we can't go back to our bosses and demand a raise to cover our popcorn habit, right away our buying power is diminished by this government intrusion into a consumer-driven economy. Not to mention, so is the popcorn attendant's, because on his night off, when he takes his date to the movies, he'll notice he's making more money, but now this date is costing him more money too. He's essentially being given the bill for his own minimum wage increase. And he'll notice the same thing at the restaurant he takes her to, and everywhere else where entry-level workers were given a completely contrived minimum wage increase. In other words, his minimum wage increase is at best a revenue-neutral transaction once the arbitrary consumer price increase offsets the arbitrary minimum wage increase he got from Uncle Sam. Meaning, at best, he'll break even, and most of the time, it's a loss leader. This partially explains why the explosion in government since 2007 has led to a reduction in American wealth to 1992 levels. We're buying goods and services at 2012 prices with a standard of living that is 20 years old. We have a saying on our radio show, why be in a hurry to be wrong? I know our willingness to immediately comment on things we actually haven't researched and analyzed frustrates some in this instant gratification world, but it also helps us to sleep well at night and avoid looking foolish, as the Huffington Post recently did. Headlines said fast food workers are demanding a living wage of $15 an hour. Of course, how do we know that's actually a living wage? Why not demand $20 an hour, or $50 an hour, or $100 an hour? A full-time job that pays $15 an hour comes out to $31,200 a year, not counting overtime. Can you really live the American dream, own a home, own a car, send your kids to good schools, and then eventually college, one family vacation per year on $31,200? After all, the federal poverty line for a family of four is currently $23,550 per year, but I digress. Of course, never wanting an opportunity to play class warfare, outlets like the Huffington Post, owned by Arianna Huffington, who's got a net worth of $35 million, so of course she identifies with the plight of the downtrodden, were overly eager to report as fact analysis of McDonald's financials from an alleged University of Kansas research assistant named Arnobio Moralex. Moralex reported that if McDonald's immediately doubled all the wages of its employees, including the $9 million CEO, it would only have to raise the cost of a Big Mac by 68 cents and its dollar menu to $1.17 per item. This comes out to a measly 17% price increase. It all sounds well and good, of course, in magical thinking land, but there's one small problem. Moralex is full of shinola. First of all, you can't on one hand simply imply McDonald's is a greedy corporation that refuses to pay its employees a living wage and then fail to recognize that if McDonald's could get away with just arbitrarily raising their prices by 17%, they already would have done it. Wouldn't the greedy corporation you're smearing actually be bilking employees and customers at the same time if they could? Of course they would. Especially since customers pay into the business model. Hello, McFly? Anybody home? The reality is, just as employees want to make more money, so does the company. Employees would like to make $15 an hour instead of $7.50, And McDonald's would like to charge $10 per Big Mac instead of $3.99 as well. But if McDonald's isn't the federal government able to just print more money whenever it wants, that means McDonald's has to live within the natural laws of economics, which state you can't spend more than you have, and if you don't make a profit, you're out of business, and that means all the jobs are gone too. That simple application of common sense should have shown the Huffington Post that hitching its wagon to Moralex was a bridge to nowhere. But when thinking emotionally, common sense is in short supply. We don't have time to think for ourselves, mind you, when we're too busy reporting the story we want to be true, even if it's not. By the way, it turns out Moralex isn't a research assistant at the University of Kansas either. He's actually just an undergraduate student there. When it printed its correction story, the Huffington Post said they ran with the story without fact-checking any of Moralex's so-called data themselves. For example, the Huffington Post said prior to the publication, they asked Moralex if his analysis included franchises, and he said that it did. My translation, hey, this college kid told us what we wanted to hear, so we just took it all at face value. I wish my editors at places like USA Today would afford me the same courtesy when I submit a column. Instead, I routinely have to provide multiple sources for my assertions. By the way, it turns out Moralex didn't factor in McDonald's franchise business model, which accounts for more than 80% of McDonald's restaurants worldwide. Oops. Moralex also asserted McDonald's currently spends 17.1% of its revenues on labor, when in reality it's almost double that. Oops. Since many McDonald's franchises are owned by small business owners, the average annual cash flow for a McDonald's franchise is only $275,000, and the average franchise experiences 43% staff turnover each year. That means doubling wages would actually require layoffs. In addition, that's not even counting the impact of the Obamacare employee mandate on these small businesses for employees working more than 30 hours per week. Oops. Furthermore, the typical household consuming McDonald's has an average annual income of $60,000 a year or lower. Since at least 1/3 of the cost of increased wages would be passed on to customers, you're not promoting a living wage, but really you're waging war on the middle class. Oops. Now, I give credit to the Huffington Post for running a thorough correction, but the truth is this was an unnecessary hit to its credibility. All they had to do was look at what their owner does to maintain her wealth to realize they were being scammed. Final question. Why do people disagree about the truth? Answer. Without an agreed-upon fixed standard, everyone becomes wise in his own eyes. Everyone believes their truth, which means somebody's truth isn't true. The fixed moral standard that once served this country well and made it the freest and most prosperous nation on the planet was the Judeo-Christian moral tradition. Since we have abandoned it, the culture has become more immoral, government has grown uncontrollably, and many once treasured institutions and associations in this country have become corrupted. That pretty much settles the argument on what truth is actually true as far as I'm concerned. The question is whether or not there is enough humility remaining in this culture to admit we've deviated off the proper path and ask for directions back to the main or narrow road. Now, after listening to my answers to those questions, you get an idea of what I'm talking about. As a conservative, are you more confident arguing the premise I just articulated in my answers to those 8 questions, or the phony fairness premise of the American left? That's what I thought. All too often, we accept the premise of the left's argument on virtually every issue, which allows them to frame the political battlefield. Any good general will attempt to shape the battlefield in a manner that gives his soldiers the best chance at victory, and we should do the same in the culture war as well. Could you imagine the possibilities if we made the left defend the constitutionality, see that as legality, of all their status schemes, and if our Republican politicians asked questions that rejected their premise from the outset? I get asked questions all the time from the left's perspective, and I never accept their premise. For example, in 2011, I did an interview on Dutch national television. One of the questions was whether those who practice homosexuality should be allowed to serve openly in the military. I believe all men and women that are physically qualified and able to conform to the Uniformed Code of Military Justice ought to be able to serve their country, I replied. But what about gays and lesbians, the Dutch host asked. I'm sorry, maybe you didn't hear me, I replied. I believe all men and women that are physically qualified and able to conform to the Uniformed Code of Military Justice ought to be able to serve their country. Now the host looked confused. So is that a yes or a no, he asked me. There are only two types of people, I told him. Men and women. He had nowhere to go after that because I totally shut his premise down by rejecting it from the outset. From there, I was on offense throughout the rest of the interview. Recently, I was asked by a newspaper reporter to comment on a story he was working on regarding the perception conservatives have a monopoly on the American flag and patriotism. The story centered around a liberal activist who was sewing into an American flag an anti-marriage, pro-immorality speech by Hillary Clinton as a protest against this perceived bias. Do you think the American flag is seen as a conservative symbol, he asked me. I answered, the American flag is a symbol of the virtues and values the generation that devised it and died for it intended it to be, which they enshrined for future generations in the Declaration of Independence and U.S. Constitution. Those virtues and values should defy labels except American. Unfortunately, as we cascade over the postmodern cliff, all such absolutes are now considered negotiable. Do you think it's appropriate to incorporate the flag into progressive liberal messages like a pro-gay marriage art project, he followed up. I think our society is better off when we conform our beliefs to the virtues and values that define the American flag rather than conforming what the flag stands for to suit our own personal whims, desires, and agendas, I answered. What's your response to the claim that conservatives have an unfair monopoly on the flag, he asked for his final question. It's clear from their own writings and actions what values and virtues our founders intended the flag to stand for. There is a God, our rights come from him, and the purpose of government is to protect those God-given rights. That's how I responded. I went on to say, that vision should transcend our current petty political labeling, and if your particular agenda doesn't reconcile with that uniquely American vision, the problem is you, not the vision. Nowhere in this dialogue did I accept the premise of the questioning, which was that the country is so divided that we have multiple interpretations of traditional Americana. Nothing could be further from the truth, for we do not get to interpret the meanings of such things when the authors themselves left such a clear record of what they meant. That is social reconstructionism, and if I accept the premise of these questions, I am accepting the validity of that pagan and un-American philosophy, which means we never arrive at the truth and just keep arguing our own perspectives. If the leftists want to make the case what they believe is in line with the founding vision of these United States, then by all means, go back into the historical record and make that case. Except they won't, because they can't. There's a simple reason why the left doesn't pay as much homage to the founding of this country as we do. And it's because most of what they believe is contrary to it, which is why they've had to take over the schools and scrub that history from the textbooks. Even one of the left's favorite founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, was so conservative compared to most liberals, they'd peg him with their favorite word for conservatives nowadays, extreme. Proving yet again that whichever side's premise is argued in the argument always wins was McCain-Palin in 2008. During each of the debates that year, including the vice presidential showdown between Sarah Palin and Joe Biden, the Democrats argued the economic collapse happening at the time was the result of too much deregulation, when the exact opposite was true. Not once in any of these debates did McCain-Palin defend the free market, and they just accepted the premise of the Democrats' phony arguments. An economic crash from too much big government resulting in President Bush insanely saying, I'll suspend free market principles to save the free market, was the perfect time for the Republican presidential ticket to take the national witness stand on behalf of free enterprise. It gave McCain-Palin a chance to triangulate between the unpopular Democrat Congress and the unpopular lame duck President Bush and channel the angst of Joe the plumber as our champions to take on the ruling class. Instead, the premise of Obama-Biden that government wasn't tinkering with our economy enough was allowed to stand. In the minds of voters, an attack unanswered or a premise unchallenged becomes true. So the American people took their cue from that and voted for more big government by voting for Obama-Biden. And they've been suffering for it ever since, proving those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Not once but twice during the 2012 presidential debates, Mitt Romney failed to confront President Obama on his version of the events that led to 4 dead Americans at the Benghazi terrorist attacks. Romney allowed Obama's false premise to be asserted on the biggest stage of the campaign, thus allowing what should have been an issue that toppled the Obama presidency to become a strength prior to voters heading to the polls. It wasn't until after the election and congressional hearings featuring several Benghazi whistleblowers, all of whom worked for Obama, that the president's account proved to be false. By then, though, it was too late, and those 4 dead Americans and their families still have yet to receive justice as of the time this book was written. One of the reasons we see so many Republicans accepting the premise of the left's argument is because they don't possess a solid worldview. Thus, most Republicans end up being defined by what they're against and not what they're for. Without a premise, they're just playing defense and often end up opposing things like homosexuals marrying because it's icky, not because they have any principled basis for doing so. Once the left exposes that, they cave on a moral issue like marriage because they can be exposed as hypocrites for their own private sexual behavior. Heck, most Republicans don't know what they're for beyond their forbidding Democrats. The left is always advancing its premise, and too many Republicans don't have one, which means unless we the people step in, we end up allowing liberals to frame the argument. We can step in when it comes to voting, but at some point we need to actually elect politicians who can advance our premise in the arena of public policy. Otherwise, we'll continue going forward over the cliff the left has us headed towards. The only debate will be how fast over that cliff we go.
And that was Chapter 4 of Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative of the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that determinism is a choice.